I haven't got a clue for how to write an intro for this video. Simply put, I've always loved reptiles, and so whenever they'd be incorporated into video games, it would always pique my interest. One thing I noticed when looking at the Nintendo 64's library is just how many games contain reptiles, be it in lizard or dinosaur form. Now, because there's so many that do appear in games such as Reptile in Mortal Kombat or the enemies in Turok, to name just a few, I've instead tried to focus this video on the games which give our scaled superheroes a feature role. As always, if you're wanting a detailed review of any of the games, rather than the overview I'll be giving you here, then head down to the description box where I'll link them all up. Chameleon Twist was one of the surprise sleeper hits of the early part of the N64's lifetime. To be honest, when I first read about it in magazines, I really didn't know what to make of it. They'd attempt to describe the game being focused around the chameleon's tongue mechanic, and how you'd use it for traversing the game's many levels, and I just couldn't see how the developer would put it off in a successful way. I didn't get this one as soon as it came out because I was skeptical about it being any good, but I did the old trick of waiting until a friend picked it up and then borrowing it from him a few weeks later once he'd completed it. In a strange way, I think that's perhaps how the game is best played, because whilst it's very fun to play once you get to grips with it, it's fair to say it is a bit of a one-trick pony. There's not much here to keep you coming back unless you're into speedrunning and you're in that scene, but for me the fairly short platform experience the game provides is definitely fun. The tongue mechanic is a gimmick clearly, but when playing it doesn't actually feel like one. The level design is actually what really makes the mechanic work really well here, and the boss battles are really well thought out. The music's fair for the time, and the graphics are a bit unrefined, even for the era when it was released, but it's really hard not to recommend this game because it'll only take you a few hours to complete for most people, and it's still cheap to pick up. And so for the price you'll pay, it's certainly worth it for the experience, so this one gets a definite thumbs up from me. It's fair to say that Yoshi's story wasn't the follow-up to Yoshi's Island that pretty much everyone was hoping for. Releasing as a 2D platform game in 1997, after everyone had been blown away by Mario's jump into 3D, was perhaps one of the reasons why many people seem to more fondly remember the game now than they did upon its initial release, as time certainly changes perceptions. It's not to say it's a bad game, it just didn't feel as groundbreaking compared to its source material. From my perspective, the game was a bit too over the top with the cheery sweetness, which by the end of the game gets a bit grating. Miyamoto himself said in interviews that the game was aimed at a younger player than they had gone for with Mario's jump into 3D, and that's reflected in the level design and the overall difficulty level of the game. Thankfully though, Nintendo didn't cheat more experienced players, because whilst younger players can whip through the game in a fairly quick manner, those dedicated fans who explore the levels or take on the Melon Challenge will find branching paths to open up unseen levels, and so there's a lot of replayability here from that sense. I'd probably say that this is the most Super Nintendo feeling of any of Nintendo's own N64 games which they released, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just for the same price as Mario 64, you're getting a whole lot less here for your money. Visually though, the game is great looking, it runs super smoothly, and the controls are perfectly tight. The audio at times can be excellent, but as a whole it's a bit too much for any extended playtime. It's a single player experience, and so if you're wanting a game to blast through quickly, just to say you've completed it, then this one would also be an easy recommend. I'd always loved Gex as a character. At the peak of Reptiles being my special interest when I was a kid, I got the original Panasonic 3DO version and absolutely loved it. Being able to stick to walls and ceilings seemed amazing for the time, and having a Gecko in my bedroom doing the exact same thing just seemed to make me love the game even more. Gex 64 on the other hand came out years later and didn't quite have the same impact on me. The game picked up a year or two after the 3DO original and basically sees Gex having a binge watching TV session for about 2 years. He then gets picked up by special agents who have news that his old adversary is back and they need his help. It's not Shakespeare, but the storyline does do just enough to give it a reason to play through and to explain why you're basically playing a 3D sequel to the 2D original. As far as 3D platform games go, then this one is pretty much underbaked. When you compare this to the absolutely staggering amount of better platform games on the console, then it's hard to recommend this above many of those, unless you're a die-hard Gex fan, and if you are, then well, you've probably already ticked this off your gaming to-do list. It was a multi-platform release designed to bring the series back from the dead, but if anything it made most reviewers feel that they shouldn't have bothered. There are some nice level concepts with some well thought out ideas here, but overall it feels like a game that was trying to bring back that 90s attitude rather than trying to move on with the times, and so often it feels like nothing more than a meme factory than an enjoyable game. So look, if you've beaten many of the console's other platform games and the genre as a whole is your thing, then sure, why not give this one a try. It's not the console's worst platform game, but it's just too flawed to really recommend it to your average gamer to go out of their way to play. Rampage World Tour on the other hand is right up my street, and I'm not sure if that's saying more about me as a person, but anyhow, it's basically an upgrade of the classic arcade smash 'em up Rampage on your Nintendo 64 console with multiplayer support. Interestingly, reviewers of the time criticised the developer's decision to go with sprites instead of polygons. But that was even a criticism of games like Mischief Makers from some publications, and so it really shows how much polygons were being pushed by the press at the time. No doubt you'll have all played some version of Rampage in your lifetimes. Just pick your character and start smashing. There's a whole score system and there are some tactics that experts will love to tell you about, but for the general population this is a multiplayer game which you can give your mum and grandma a controller and they can kind of get the hang of what they need to do. As a single player experience the game can feel kind of empty. Whilst there's a lot taking place on the screen sometimes, and that's especially apparent in the later levels, the game only really comes to life when you're with friends for this one. Visually it's rough around the edges, the overall presentation is gritty and this rolls over to the sound and visual effects in the game. It looks like an early 90s video game despite coming out in 1998 on Nintendo 64 and a year earlier on other consoles. Despite its flaws though, the game was always one of the more popular rental titles at video stores, and I remember at one time the game being out of stock for months anytime I wanted to hire it just for a weekend. Despite the first one not really setting sales figures alight, Chameleon Twist did still do well enough for a follow-up to be put into production. Either that or the studio had spent so much money developing the chameleon tongue mechanic that they needed a sequel just to break even. Whatever the reason may be, Chameleon Twist 2 is in many ways the perfect sequel. It takes the best parts from the first game and improves on everything else. The game runs smoother, the visuals have taken a slight bump, and there are a couple of new features to entice fans of the original into the game, so it doesn't just feel like basically an expanded version of Chameleon Twist 1. Now I do prefer Chameleon Twist 2 because it added some much needed skills like the parachute and also the ability to vault vertically with your tongue. They also made each of the game's worlds longer, which does make it longer to play through, but the game is still fairly easy from start to finish and it's not really a lengthy experience, and I'd say that many gamers could probably polish this one off in an extended session. Most disappointingly though was the game didn't have a multiplayer mode, which I really felt hurt the package. And given how quickly the story can be completed, it almost makes this title a better rental than a purchase. If you have someone who already has this title, then just borrow it from them. But given the cost of this sequel to buy as a cart, and it's also quite harder to find, then perhaps it's not really worth the money unless you're going after a complete set. Is Iggy actually a reptile? Well, he's green and he has spikes and he looks a bit scaly, and so this is one I'll give the benefit of the doubt considering it was developed by Iguana and published by Acclaim. Funnily enough, when the game's concept was first pitched, it was flat out rejected. After 2 weeks a prototype version of the game was made and then that decision was reversed. It's fair to say that may have been because there's not really anything quite like this. It's sort of a racing game, it's sort of an obstacle course game, and it's sort of a battle game which really doesn't fit into any typical gaming genre. Whilst I would say that it doesn't master any of these ideas particularly well, the overall game is still wacky enough to make this one worth checking out, even if it's just for the novelty factor. There are 10 worlds in the game and over 100 courses to play through, and with multiplayer support I'd say this one is actually fun to play in both modes, simply because of how fast and frantic the gameplay is. Iggys Reckin Balls is now owned by Throwback Entertainment, who purchased the rights as part of the 2006 Acclaim bankruptcy case. So will we ever see a follow-up to this? Well, it's really hard to say because the game doesn't really have much of a following. but I'd actually be really interested to see what could be done in this day and age with it. I think that a super fast title with hundreds of players over online gaming on each course could make this one worth reviving, but until then, the console game I'd still think is worth looking into. Rampage 2 Universal Tour is a prime example of the gaming studio classic line, if it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. So what you have here is basically more of the same. As much as I love the Nintendo 64, I feel that the version of this game to play is probably the PlayStation 1 version. That version contains full motion video, and it also has an expanded range of audio and music tracks when compared to the N64 release. The Nintendo 64 version gives you those instant load times, and so it's a trade-off as to what's really important to you. The game sees you pick a new monster, and in a cool twist you're actually choosing to rescue one of the previous game's original monsters. And that's about as deep as the storyline gets, because as expected, you're just here to smash things up and have some mindless fun. And that game really does deliver that in spades. When you play games, you're not always wanting a deep storyline, complex controls, or some overly engrossed theme to the game. Sometimes all you want to do is just switch off, blow off some steam, and feel like you can stop playing at any moment and just be done. And that's exactly what you get with this title. As expected though, it is best played with friends for the most chaotic and enjoyable experience. But like World Tour, there is a single player mode, and so as an overall package I'd suggest this one as a quick rental or to borrow it from your friend. Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko is a 1999 release from Crystal Dynamics, which yet again sees them try to make Gex the 3D platform icon they were desperate for him to become. As a sequel to Gex 64, it rounded off the series trilogy in a quite underwhelming way. You could say that this was one final throw of the dice to make the character relevant again, and it failed. But once again it left a platform game which is overshadowed on Nintendo 64 by some other masterpieces. They wanted to make this game more story focused than any of the previous games, and that's perhaps why the story isn't quite as cringeworthy. They also had a whole host of ideas that they weren't able to put into Gex 64, but instead found ways to squeeze them into this one. Overall, it's a fairly solid platform game, nothing spectacular, and it does have its cool moments. It's perhaps the second best Gex game in the short series, but I think if the game had really wanted to stand out and do something different, they should have returned to its original 2D roots and gone ahead with something head-to-head like Yoshi's Story, than try and remain a 3D game with a clear lack of skill to produce a game to go up against its direct competition. The biggest problem for me though were the shanky frame rates, the stuttering controls, and the fact that at times the game seemed to be just trying too hard to be edgy. And when doing so, it left you with a feeling that, well, it was a bit of a sense of a cringe-worthy moment, and you also end up contemplating what you're actually doing with your life playing this game when there's so many other better games you could be playing. And so there you have it, there's my roundup of the Nintendo 64 games that have lizards or reptiles as a starring role. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what your favourite reptile on the console was. Was it in any of the games I've shown today, or a lizard from another series? As always, let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comment section down below, and until next time.